All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to the next to last of the 2021-2022 EER seminar series. We are excited to have Dr. Paty Jaimes here. She is a new instructional consultant of DEI at CRLT Engine. So for those of us on North Campus, she's up here with us once we're all here in person in our offices. And I look forward to meeting her in person, but I'm excited to get to hear about this important work this way for right now. I'll shut up and turn it over to you.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for having me here today and for coming to my talk. So to begin, let me tell you a little bit about myself. So I have an earth science background. So I graduated from Northeastern Illinois University, which is in Chicago, with a bachelor's degree in earth science. And what I found towards the end of my degree was that while I really love STEM and science and nature and all the things that I was learning about in my courses, I also was very interested in learning about people, working with people, and also concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so this led me to pursue my PhD in STEM education at Michigan State University, where my research interest focused on using asset-based and critical race frameworks to explore how scientists from minoritized groups navigated and persisted in STEM careers. And I just graduated in August, so the research that I will be presenting on today is actually my dissertation research, or parts of it. This led me to where I currently am, which is an instructional consultant of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching in Engineering, also known as CRLT Engine. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about my research. So for many, many decades, NSFs and other government entities have heavily invested in broadening participation efforts in order to diversify the STEM fields. However, despite these efforts, representation is still lacking in many STEM disciplines. And as a graduate student, I kept asking the question, why? There's all these programs, like why is this still a problem? And so as I was familiarizing myself with the literature, I came across the terms social and cultural capital. And so in the simplest of forms, social capital is who you know, and cultural capital is what you know. And so many of the broadening participation efforts in STEM are grounded in the notion of social and cultural capital. And so this is most seen in research and academic bridge programs that seek to connect students with academic mentors and provide them with the knowledge and skills that are needed to assimilate into academia and into a STEM major. And while these programs have been very useful, I am somebody who has benefited from these programs myself. They are rooted in what we call a deficit model form of thinking, which assumes that individuals from minoritized groups are lacking something that inhibits their ability to participate in STEM. However, this approach to broadening participation does not consider the strengths or assets that students bring with them to academia and into STEM, which stem from their lived experiences. And it also fails to consider the structural barriers such as sexism, heteronormativity, racism, and ableism that individuals encounter, which contribute to a toxic academic and STEM culture, often resulting in those minoritized individuals opting to leave STEM. So to shift away from the deficit model of exploring broadening participation efforts in STEM, I decided to focus my research on exploring how individuals from minoritized groups persist in STEM careers. And so one of the frameworks that I encountered as a graduate student was community cultural wealth, which is a framework that is grounded in cultural capital theory through the lens of critical race theory. However, that is a theory that is beyond the scope of my talk today, but I do want to acknowledge that it is grounded in both of those theories. And essentially what community cultural wealth is, it is one framework of many that considers the strengths and resources and assets that students bring with them to education and to STEM settings, which enable them to successfully navigate those institutions. And so this is what we consider an asset-based model. So the overarching concept that I decided to use in my dissertation research was the concept of capital. And a very, very basic definition of capital within the context of my research is that capital is financial and non-financial resources. And so I'll talk a little bit more about this as I delve into my study, but in the literature, there are 5 major forms of capital, which include social, cultural, economic, symbolic, and human. However, I quickly learned that there are so many other forms of capital that also exist in the STEM ed literature. And it got to a point where it was really confusing, both for me and for some of my committee members. And so this confusion is actually inspired the format of my dissertation research. And so broadly speaking, in my dissertation, I looked at what assets do minoritized scientists bring to STEM? And so my dissertation was actually consisted of 3 different studies, so 3 different chapters. And so the first was a systematic literature review that explored the types of capital that exist in the STEM education literature. And from this, we created a capital framework model, which is what I will talk about shortly. The second chapter and study of my dissertation focused on both testing the model to see if we can apply it to explore the persistence of scientists from minoritized groups in STEM, and also, is there anything missing that did not emerge during the systematic literature review? And so, we did interviews to test the model. And so we ended up modifying the capital framework model a bit, which leads me to my third study, which I will talk about as well, which looked at the question of how does the model explain the persistence of Latinx scientists? And so this was also conducted in the form of interviews. And so today I will talk about study 1 and study 3. And so all of these papers are in the process of being submitted to these journals. Along with some of my co-authors. Okay, so study 1. So for the systematic literature review, I looked at 3 different research questions. So what forms of capital exist in the STEM ed literature? How are those capitals defined? And what model emerges from those capitals? And so this was a systematic literature review. 184 documents were analyzed, and then we developed the capital framework model. And so the systematic literature review was also following the systematic literature review guidelines of Borrego et al. And her paper, written in 2014 or published in 2014, is actually grounded in engineering education, in the engineering education discipline. Okay, so to begin my systematic literature review, I first spoke with a librarian. That is something that, again, is recommended. It is something I encourage you all to do if you are performing one, because the librarians have a lot of knowledge about how to best conduct the type of, there's so many ways to do this, so that they can give you the best guidelines, and they also provide you with a lot of useful information. And so at the librarian suggestion, I actually did my search on 3 major databases. And again, these were based on her recommendation. And so these were ProQuest, Scopus, and Web of Science. And so the terms that I searched were capital, and science, or STEM, or engineering, and education or career. And it's important to note that the search was done in all 3 databases on the same day. And from this, we use the Covidence software, again, at the recommendation of the librarian. And this was also a software that MSU subscribed to, so it was free for me to use. And so this was very useful for deduplication and abstract screening. And so deduplication basically means that this software helps you remove duplicate articles. Because if you're searching on all three databases, like you are going to come across duplicate articles. And so again, this is very helpful. And so let me actually, okay, so in order to screen and narrow down the documents that would actually be included in the study, we had to develop inclusion and exclusion criteria. And so I've just listed all the inclusion criteria, and basically, if they didn't meet these criteria, they were excluded. And so this helped take us from over 5,000 documents to 184 that were included, that were actually analyzed and included in the study. And so the analysis was broken up into several parts. So to answer research questions 1 and 2, which is what capitals exist and how are they defined, me and 2 other researchers read of the documents that we read full text. We read through them and recorded the types of capital that emerged and their definitions. And we recorded the definitions on a spreadsheet. We then went through the definitions of all the capitals together and synthesized them, the different variations of like into a single, the different definition variations into a single definition. So for example, academic capital, in the literature, it had like 4 different types of definitions, which was kind of evolved like supporting college going, curricular choices, educational and academic experiences, and academic preparation. So all of these things were considered to be academic capital in the documents that we read. And so after discussing and going through these definitions together, we actually synthesize all of these into the accumulation. Academic capital is the accumulation of an individual's educational and academic experiences that makes them knowledgeable about academic norms. And so we did this for a few capital types. And so once we had the definitions down, so the systematic literature review is a lot of process, a lot of things. So thank you for bearing with me. So once we did that, we combined capitals that had near identical definitions. And the most perfect example of this was economic capital, financial capital, and physical capital. At the essence, all of these refer to having access to financial, physical, and material resources. And so we define these as, we just lump them all as being economic capital. And that's because economic capital is like one of the 5 major general categories. Okay, so finally, to answer research question 3, which is what model, we did a thematic analysis using a code book. And so in the next slide, I'll show you a little bit about how that code book looked like. And so what we actually ended up doing is that we refer to cultural, economic, human, symbolic, and social capital as primary forms of capital. And all the other capitals, for example, academic capital, we consider to be secondary forms of capital. And so what we, which is basically me and my 2 co-researchers, what we did is when we were doing our coding, we coded the definitions of the secondary forms of capital in alignment with the primary forms. And so let me show you. So for example, when looking at the definition of academic capital, it aligned very well with the definition of cultural capital. The same for peer social capital, scientific capital, etc. And secondary forms of capitals whose definitions did not align with any of the 5 primary forms of capital were grouped into another category. And so from our search, as I mentioned, these 5 primary forms of capital emerged. So we ended up with 35, and of these 35, 5 were the 5 primary. And then we ended up with 30 secondary forms of capital. After we combined those like forms, so remember that economic capital, we ended up removing 4 types of secondary capital, which means that 26 secondary capitals remained for coding, and so which is what this table represents. And during that coding process, we removed 5 types of capital. And so the reason that we removed them is because, as I mentioned, we were coding the definitions of those secondary forms of capital in alignment with the definitions of the primary forms of capital. And there were some capitals that were grouped that fell under multiple primary forms of capital. So to us, that expressed like redundancies, like those were already represented in the, within the 5. So we just removed them. And so at the end, we ended up with 21 secondary capitals in our model. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so for cultural capital. So cultural capital had the most secondary forms of capital. And broadly speaking, cultural capital can, again, it's norms and values, be knowledgeable about norms and values. And so we were actually able to categorize the capitals that we found into different themes, which included being knowledgeable about academic norms, cultural norms, and disciplinary norms. And so these capitals, like from academic to technical, all fall within those larger groups. Navigational capital refers to being able to navigate institutions and systems that are unfamiliar to, that were not designed with minoritized individuals in mind. And so that sort of stood on its own. And then for me, resistant capital really was fascinating. And so the reason for that is because while all these other forms of cultural capital spoke to being knowledgeable about norms and values, about navigating academia and in STEM, resistant capital was defined and viewed as using knowledge about social inequities and applying that knowledge to push back against norms and assumptions. And so the reason that we categorized this as cultural capital was because it still referred to knowledges and skill sets. However, instead of not assimilating to a dominant culture, an individual uses resistant capital to question, push back, and even change the norms. And so this is why we call this like the antithesis of cultural capital. And this is where we start to think about the idea of like, how do we reimagine and how do we rethink about like what we understand cultural capital and all these other capitals to be. So social capital had, referring to like the networks of people that lead to resources and opportunities, had the second most secondary forms of capital. And so this was 5. And so it's ranged from college, familial, parental, peer-related, and STEM social capital. And so these really refer to the various networks that students have access to, which refers to advisors, families, parents, peers, and then STEM social capital refers to like advisors and mentors and people that they find in STEM. So finally, economic capital, again, it refers to having money or financial resources. So there was no secondary capitals that aligned with that definition because we just lumped them all into one. Symbolic capital is associated with honor or prestige, and also the recognition that comes from that honor and prestige. And so we found that there was one capital, scientific capital, that aligned with symbolic capital. And scientific capital was basically symbolic capital within the context of STEM. So in its definite. And so the reason that I am not including definitions in these slides is because it is a lot of text, but I do have a table at the end of the presentation if you are interested. So scientific capital really refers to like being the recognition that scientists get that allows them to get grants and get awards. And again, all these things within the context of STEM. And so human capital, my least favorite, because it is just so complex. And it really, we included it in our model. I'm including it in my talk because it is something that emerged. But we really won't talk about it much because human capital is like, it's really complex. And the way that it's used in the literature is really from like the organizational and business perspective, which is again beyond the scope of like what I am using this framework for. But basically, it taught human capital is like the accumulated skills and knowledge of an organization's employees, which creates money and value for the employer. Again, not the best definition, but human capital is just really complicated. But there was one capital that aligned with decisional capital, one secondary capital, which was decisional capital. And so this is what we have so far. We have these cultural capitals, the social, economic, symbolic, and human. But remember, there was capitals there were secondary forms of capital that were sorted into another category. And so in our search or during our analysis, there was 3 of them. So these were aspirational, identity, and psychological. And so me and my co-researchers, we spent some time reading the definitions and going over the definitions for these 3 capitals. We tried to see if there was like a theme, what kind of theme emerged? Are there, and so what we ended up finding was that all the definitions for all 3 of them spoke to intrinsic strengths and resources. And so this was something that did not actually align with any of the 5 major capital categories that I've talked to you about. And so we decided to create a 6th major category, which we called intrinsic capital, which refers to those intrinsic strengths and resources. And so this is the final capital model. And so, as I mentioned earlier, human capital is like a really complex concept. But the way that we described it in my paper was that human capital can be understood as the accumulated skills and knowledge that an individual has, which is of value to their employer. And so this is why for us, in the most basic sense, we understood human capital to be really of an accumulation of all these capitals that you see inside the box, which is why human capital is outside this box. But again, we won't really talk too much about human capital, but I am including it in our model. And so why is this important? So I just spoke to you, and it was the systematic literature review. It's a very tedious process. So again, thank you for bearing with me. But why does this matter? So for us and for me, this model demonstrates relationships between these different types of capital, and it also provides an understanding for individuals that are new to capital theory, that are new to STEM education literature. And so to the best of our knowledge, there really is not a paper that explores the relationships between capitals in this way. There are papers that look at social capital, that look at cultural capital, that look at those like in relation to other theories. But as far as I know, there isn't one that looks at all of the capitals in the way that we looked at it in this paper. And then it also reduces redundancies among the like forms of capital. Again, when I first started doing this research, it was really confusing because a lot of things, there's so many things that came up. Some of it seemed very similar to another concept that I had just read. And so this sort of gets rid of those redundancies. And then also finally, the notion of resistant capital and using that strength and knowledge to push back against norms was something that I found fascinating. And again, it helps us begin thinking about reimagining how these concepts of social and cultural and all these other capitals are manifested in STEM education, and how we can use those to reimagining broadening participation efforts. And of course, this is in alignment with the addition of a new major capital category, which was intrinsic capital. Okay. So now that I've explained the model, I'm going to give you just a brief overview of study 2 because it's important to talk about that before we get into study 3. However, it's just one slide. And study 3 is actually what I am most excited about, but I can't get into study 3 without explaining the model. And so in study 2, we tested the capital framework model to see if we can use it to explore the career trajectories of scientists from minoritized groups. And so what we ended up doing is we ended up doing interviews with about, I think, 15 or 16 different scientists from one or more minoritized groups. And so this included scientists that were racial and ethnic minorities, people that identified as queer, people that identified as disabled. And so what we learned is that yes, the model works. We can use it to explore the persistence of these scientists in STEM. However, something that was like super interesting was that while all the scientists in the study belong to one or more minoritized groups, it was only the scientist of color that spoke about a strength that wasn't in our original capital framework model, but we ended up adding it to the model, and we identified it as categorized it as critical consciousness capital, and so defined as a marginalized individual's ability to analyze and take action to address social oppression. All participants of color express having an understanding and awareness of the social, environmental, and scientific injustices that impacted their communities. And most scientists express the desire to use their scientific knowledge and skills to help their communities. And so critical consciousness is a concept that does appear in education, but has not been discussed like as a strength or asset within the context of STEM. And so my co-authors and I ended up adding critical consciousness as a secondary capital to the intrinsic capital category. And thus like our model was modified. And so for the final study of my dissertation, and so here is like the updated model. And so this is where we added critical consciousness. So for the final study of my dissertation, we decided to explore, to apply the modified model to answer the question, how does the modified capital framework model help explain the career trajectory of Latinx scientists? And so we conducted interviews, and then like we coded the interviews using the modified capital framework model as like our code book. And so we did 10 interviews with Latinx scientists. And so these were semi-structured interviews, and we probed, and the individuals were people from multiple disciplines, engineering, earth and environmental sciences, physics, people that male, female, and then we had individuals that were both students and professionals in the field. And so our interview protocol probed, we were trying to find out the internal and external resources that Latinx scientists relied on to persist in STEM careers. And so, as I mentioned, like we did deductive coding. And so when you're doing deductive coding, that means that you're coding your data like using a predetermined code book. And so for us, that was the modified capital framework model. And so, as I mentioned, I had 2 other co-authors helping me with the coding, and we were of these interviews. We continuously checked in with each other and made sure that we were in agreement and in alignment with the codes. And then, you know, if there was any misalignment, we talked about that and came to agreements and stuff. So at this point, I will share some results. I'm not gonna go too in depth for some capitals because these are things that as education researchers, you probably have heard about already. Like for example, in this slide, there are no quotes. Okay. So what we found was that Latinx participants relied on economic and social capital to persist in STEM. I mean, these are two of the capitals that they relied on. And so these two are actually connected to each other. So in our interviews, we found that access to economic capital appeared in the forms of scholarships, fellowships, federal financial aid, family contributing to somebody's education, etc. And so access to those financial resources stemmed from having access to social capital, whether it was your advisors helping you navigate how to apply for FAFSA, family money, peers helping you with scholarship applications or making you aware of opportunities, and the same with mentors, writing letters of recommendation. A lot of funding opportunities in STEM require letters of recommendation, and so access to economic capital was connected to having access to social capital. And so for cultural capital, as we expected, we found that individuals spoke about having access and utilizing the different forms of academic capital, discipline and technical capitals, and navigational capital to be able to successfully pass their STEM courses, do research, and engage in doing science. And so again, that we expected what I want to talk more about are those lesser recognized forms of capital. So for example, credential capital. And so this really refers to the credibility that somebody has due to their membership within a certain group. And so in this case, for this quote, this refers to the credibility that one has of belonging to a minoritized community, that they are doing scientific outreach in. And so credential capital is a strength for both the individual and for science. And STEM outreach, there's a lot of STEM outreach, especially in vulnerable communities. However, when scientists from dominant identities, dominant communities, enter a minoritized and vulnerable community, the trust is not there. Community members might be wary and scientists imposing like their way of knowing and doing science on these communities isn't always the best way. However, if somebody from that community goes and connects with those communities, they can leverage their knowledge of STEM and the knowledge of the community's needs and norms and culture to be able to better engage with them. And so this quote is one of my favorites, the ability to code switch and the street credibility. When you're talking about brown and Black communities that have been disenfranchised and oppressed for too long, trust is a big piece of that. So being able to go into a community, having had struggled with a lot of the same issues, really helps me to connect with those communities. So this was powerful. And so another interesting capital within the context of cultural capital that I was also very fascinated was like this notion of hidden capital, which really refers to unrecognized mathematic and scientific skills. And so as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk today, broadening participation efforts have traditionally focused on providing minoritized individuals with the scientific skills and knowledge and networks that they are deemed to be lacking. However, this isn't true. Again, that reinforces the notion of a deficit model. So in this example, this participant talked about their father teaching them what they know about engineering through fixing cars and houses. Despite their father having dropped out of school and not having a traditional degree, the scientific knowledge that he passed on to his child was valuable. And so my favorite part of this quote was which made me realize the value of education, not from an institution, not formal education, but there's plenty of avenues to knowledge. And so we know from my research and other articles and other research that communities of color have many strengths and resources and assets that are not valued or recognized in the dominant culture. And in this case, it's like the STEM community. So we really need to expand our understanding and our acceptance of what does it mean to be a scientist? What does it mean to do STEM? And so moving on, we also found examples of symbolic capital and intrinsic capital in these interviews. But now let's talk about critical consciousness capital. So almost every single participant spoke about this in their interviews. And so here are a few sample quotes. The impact that I would like to make in STEM is to give opportunity to those people who cannot afford an education because of their economic status. If I ever get the chance, I can provide scholarship offers or any funding offers for these students. And I'm in a position where I have a graduate research fellowship from the government. I'll have a physics PhD, but I'm from the hood. I'm still a revolutionary, and these things allow me to be a revolutionary. I have the platform to do the effects that the people before me didn't get the chance to. And then I realized that civil engineering is one of the few majors in STEM that incorporated explicitly concepts of science and social issues. And I just thought, wow, I could finally do something to make a difference with a degree that would directly impact the community that I am living in. And so to me, this was really powerful. All of these quotes, or these are just a few example quotes. There were many, many more. But scientists have this, traditionally have this view and this idea that science is objective and that science and social issues, especially those that affect minoritized communities, are separate. But the reality is that they are not. And the beauty of this critical consciousness capital that I found in my research is that scientists of color are thinking about the intersection of those things. And so what did we learn? Basically, the model works. We definitely found that the traditionally recognized capitals, social, cultural, all of those things emerge as strengths and resources that Latinx scientists use to persist in STEM. However, like my favorite part of this study was exploring and learning more about the hidden or about the lesser recognized forms of capital. And furthermore, the accumulation of all the traditionally recognized and the lesser recognized leads to the development of critical consciousness capital. Because when you are accessing and utilizing and learning about these traditional, the traditional stuff, you're making connections with mentors, advisors, scientists, you're learning how to, you're learning those things, but then you're also combining that with the strengths that you bring from your community, the knowledge, the skills, and that helps you see help scientists of color see the intersection and be able to do innovative and important work with their knowledge and their skill set to help their communities. And so how should we reimagine STEM? So begin by recognizing and valuing the assets that Latinx and other minoritized scientists bring to STEM, bring to science, right? Stop viewing them through the deficit model. And incorporate and leverage those assets and those resources. For example, doing community engaged science. That's like one example. And then we know that the scientists of color are already doing this. There is this paper I think came out a few years ago that shows that NIH gives less awards to African American scientists. And often, I believe when they did the analysis, the projects that African American and scientists of color often submitted had to do with community and had to do with those social implications, as opposed to the mechanicals and the technical science stuff. Those had higher funding rates. And so again, this is just one article, and that is an example of how this deficit model is embedded in STEM and how these strengths and resources aren't really recognized or valued. And so in all, the message is for reimagining STEM education is to use an asset-based approach to broadening participation efforts in STEM. I use capital in my dissertation because that is what I came across, but capital is only one framework of many. So these are a few examples of other theories, and there are many more. And basically, what they all have in common is that these theories and frameworks and concept consider the knowledge and skills that students bring, both from like their cultural background and their lived experiences, and sees the value that those assets have within the context of both education and STEM. And so with that, I invite you to come to my workshop in a few weeks, which is labeled Reimagining STEM Education, Shifting Towards an Anti-Deficit Teaching and Learning. So I can talk a little bit more about how we can shift towards more of an asset-based approach. And I believe that concludes my talk.
Thank you so much. There is a question in the Q&A, and
Okay.
Everyone should feel comfortable to put them in the Q&A or in the chat. I can read it to you if that helps. Can you speak more about the reasoning for the inclusion criteria? So this is back when you were talking about your scoping review, where you only included articles where the definition is based on a single theory.
So I only included articles that had definitions because what we were quoting were the definitions. So if there was many articles that spoke about cultural, social, like these different types of capital, but they were never defined. So with it, like for the purposes of like what I was wanting to do, like if they were not defined, if the concept was not defined, I could not include it. Like it would not make sense. I couldn't make up a definition. So that's why. And I can stop sharing, or I mean, I can also show, let's see. So the definitions are, it's a lot, but if you're interested, here's some.
Nice.
How individual can use this. Okay, so for the apply an asset-based mindset in their own classes, or how individual instructors can use this understanding about different forms of capital to better teaching and learning. Yes, it will be covered in my workshop, but so in my workshop, I will delve a little bit more about what a deficit model is. So I did speak of it very briefly in the talk. I defined it very broadly, but in order to really be able to shift towards an asset-based approach to teaching, you really have to be able to understand and recognize how the deficit model is embedded in like your own teaching and learning. And so for leveraging resources and capitals, so I will say not all of them are very obvious. So for example, aspirational capital refers to like just the ability to not give up and be able to keep your hopes and your dreams and your goals alive despite like unfortunate circumstances. And so that's something that might be difficult to include or incorporate in your courses, but there are probably other ways that you can use it in your interactions with students. So as something that might not be obvious is that teaching and learning is not just limited to what's happening in the classroom. When you are working with students in your research lab, when you're recruiting students, there are all these other aspects of academia and science that involves teaching and learning. And so thinking about applying this asset-based approach beyond just the classroom and in your everyday activities is a useful tool, especially when you're interacting with students. So when you're reviewing scholarship applications, when you're reviewing admissions criteria, like what are the standards that you're using? Are you wanting students that meet like the traditional like Western middle class, like that kind of fit in with that culture? Again, when you're thinking about a deficit model, that the deficit model sort of reinforces the concept of assimilation, and that the current STEM culture is best, and doesn't really question, well, how are we doing things? Why is it that diversity is a problem? What is leaving? And it doesn't really question like the systems that are in place. So anyway, so I don't know if that answered your question. There's a lot. And so I will talk a little bit more about that in my workshop. And I will tell you, it did take me a while to develop the workshop because there are so many layers and so many ways to approach it. So yeah, I encourage you to sign up. And I do think that after I stop sharing, I can include the link in the chat for
It's
registration.
Tertia got you.
Oh, yay. Thank you, Tertia. Hi, Tertia. And are there more questions?
Yep, there's a question in the Q&A and one in the chat. I'll read the Q&A one. Andrew Moffat says, thanks for a really powerful talk. There must have been a lot of overlap and gray areas between different types of capital. How did you go about drawing those boundaries?
And so so when we were doing those boundaries and like doing those separations, that it really helps that there was two other people doing the coding with me, and there is a lot of overlap. And even as I was showing the results, like there is a lot of like interaction. And so just having continuous discussions, because it is very easy as like a single researcher to overthink it and to just kind of go down the rabbit hole. So I guess I might not be able to like give you like specific like things, but that continuous discussion and engagement with my co-researchers really helped. And then
Thank you. And trying to scroll back from Becky Metz asks, can you talk about which forms of secondary capital were the most difficult to separate, and did you allow for double coding? So related to the earlier question.
Yeah, no, so if there was like double coding, so those were like the ones that were eliminated. So I mentioned that there was like five, I believe it was five that were like eliminated when we were doing the coding because they were grouped as aligning with multiple primary forms of capital. And so to us, that just meant, well, one, it's redundant. Two, it is difficult to categorize. And a lot of those, I can't remember the exact definition, but I believe that educational capital is a capital that came up. And when you looked at the definition, like it literally said a combination of like social, cultural, and blah, blah, blah capital that does so. So again, that would fall under like cultural, social, whatever. And so that was already represented in the model by those primary forms of capital. And so no, we did not allow for double coding. And so the secondary forms of capital that were difficult to separate. So the most obvious example to me was maybe familial and parental. Let me see. Yes. And so ultimately, they were listed as being separate because the way that parental social capital was defined was they were just referring to parents being involved in their children's educational journey, whereas familial capital had a more inclusive, I guess, definition of what family meant, which included their community networks. It did not necessarily refer to like blood relatives, and really it was just different than just parents. And so those were two that we kind of went back and forth on, but we ultimately kept them as like two separate ones.
Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording.